even when they have participated in these, they never get any credit for their work, right? They're looked over historically and not even acknowledged. So a perfect example of this is in Hidden Figures, right? Where we have actually the first computers were not machinery, right? In the sense that we think of computers today. I mean, there were mechanical components, right? There was hardware, but the actual software, right, where we think of most of the programming going into, the very first computer software was actually female, right? So these were women whose job it was to manipulate the data and to engage in feeding the hardware and, coordinating everything and analyzing the outputs, right? So the first computers were actually female, but again, we associate, right, computer programming, computer technology, primarily with the male dominance of other technology fields, right? And so other, perhaps reasons for why these sorts of male-dominated disciplines persist is that even though we do have more women entering into these fields, it could be argued that, again, as we're socialized as women, we're not as encouraged to pursue those types of disciplines, right? We might be encouraged to concentrate on what are considered the more inferior spheres of culture, right, through things like studying the humanities, right? So this is the idea that we see more women who are encouraged to go into maybe the social sciences, right? Liberal arts, humanities, more so than men. But even though we might see more women in those fields, achievement still tends to be reserved largely for the males in that area, right? So again, right, we might see many women in the positions of teachers, right? But those who are lauded as the experts, right? The sort of, they often use the quote, founding fathers, right, of those disciplines, right? Those are still reserved for men. The next part of this is the use of force in maintaining and asserting sexism, right? So patriarchies have institutionalized force against women through their legal systems. For example, there have been strict patriarchal implementations which prohibit against illegitimacy. So, right, in this case, the illegitimate procreation of an offspring, right, meaning that has occurred outside of the institution of marriage, or the notion of sexual autonomy at all, right, a woman being able to make her own decisions about the sexual acts that she engages in. And the punishment for this, not for everyone involved, but usually solely for the women, has been death. Right, so a contemporary example of this still being the case is in Saudi Arabia, where if a case of adultery has been found out, right, so if someone has engaged in sexual acts with someone while one or more of those parties were married to someone else, then only the woman is stoned to death. Right? Men are not stoned to death for these activities. I think the only account of men being stoned to death is if they are found to have engaged in homosexual behavior. But men are not punished in these cases unless they are seen as having thieved, right, or stolen the property, meaning the woman, from another man, right? So the man would only be punished if the woman were married to someone else. But the woman is punished in all cases no matter what. Other aspects of death as being a use of force in patriarchal systems, it has to do with the deprivation of allowing women control over their bodies, right? So when we say make safe abortions illegal, what we are doing is essentially condemning those women who seek to have an abortion, right? A higher likelihood of their own fatality. Right? And so the idea here is that when you make something illegal, that is not necessarily going to stop those actions from happening, right? So these are the same arguments used in favor of legalizing, drugs and things like this. Prostitution is that, again, these things are going to continue to happen. So why not legalize them so that we can regulate them and make them safe, right? But the idea is when you simply make it illegal, all you're doing is ensuring that women who are in need of having an abortion will have to seek that assistance either by their own means, right, or through some black market or unsafe sort of experience, right? Which will, of course, increase the likelihood that will happen. It will happen in an unhealthy and unsafe way for both parties. So the reaction to the violence against women in the patriarchies is, of course, often ambivalent, right? So people don't seem to be nearly as concerned about what happens to women as they are in these cases about how it affects the larger system, or in the case of abortion, how it affects the offspring, right? So women's status is considered secondary to the other supposedly interested parties, right? And this could also be, discussed in relation to pornography, right? In that it too has utilized elements of force, right? Especially in its history, where, women were sort of roped into these industries or misled or perhaps manipulated to enter into these industries, which are not necessarily targeting a female demographic, right? They're made for men, right, to be consumed by men. Okay, so what are the historical relationships, right, between myths and religions and sexism, right? So what she's talking about here is how anthropology, as well as religious and literary myth, have sort of reinforced or at least made explicit these sort of patriarchal convictions about women, right? So the idea is that the image of women as we know it is an image created by men and fashioned to suit their needs. This has to do with the fact that, just historically speaking, we don't have as many narratives from female authors, right?